Nice to see you.
Yeah, we normally wait just a few minutes and let people virtually straggle in.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and if more people coming in, that's fine. Thank you everyone for coming to our virtual seminar. We're really excited today to have Amy Ando from the University of Illinois. Many of you got to meet with her. She's presenting some really interesting work that I'm excited to learn more about. So Amy is a professor at the University of Illinois in the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics, and since 2015 has served as a university fellow for Resources for the Future. Yeah, thank you so much for coming, Amy, and we're excited to learn about some of what you're working on.
Thank you, Matt and Alex and everybody. Thanks for the invitation to join you and all the conversations this morning. It was really nice talking with people. Let's see, now let me do slideshow. There we go. Okay, so I need to make point out two important things here. One is that I am most decidedly second author on this paper. My co-author, Li-Ching Li, this is really her idea, and she did most of the work. I've just had the pleasure of being along for the ride as a collaborator with her on it. The second thing is that this is not a completely polished, almost published paper. We have gathered the data and we have started analyzing the data, and we do have some results that I'll share with you, but it is a great time for input. Don't tell me how we should have changed the survey, because the survey has been administered, but there's plenty of scope for new work to be done in how we analyze the data, and so I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that. All right, so I think for this audience, I don't need to point out that people place value on protecting nature. We see that in donations to nonprofits who do nature conservation, and there's been a lot of research about the value of nature conservation. There's also some research, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, that indicates that the experiences that we have in childhood may very well shape the values that we have for protecting nature. So if you're like this little kid and you grew up running around outside looking at birds, you might be more interested in birds and kind of grow up with that as something that you know how to recognize birds and you think it's really interesting. And so you might just develop an affinity. This kid is standing in a grassy field, so maybe he grew up feeling like that's home, that's something that he likes and wants to keep around. maybe there's knowledge. So in bird watching, maybe he's learned what a lot of birds are. And so when he goes outside, instead of just saying, oh, look, there's a small chirpy bird, he can say, oh, look, that's an eastern meadowlark. And that kind of amenity capital means that he gets more value out of his future experiences with nature. We couple this possibility with the fact that urbanization seems to be reducing the extent to which people are interacting with nature. There's lots of tearing of hair and gnashing of teeth about the fact that kids don't get outside and they're spending all their time inside on their dreaded screens, especially now in coronavirus. But actually, there's a lot of discussion about a secular decline in fishing and hunting as activities. So could that lead to a negative feedback loop in the future on the work that we do for stewarding nature? This is a little, you'll see these signs in my community. Right now, there's an initiative on the ballot to increase the ability of our forest preserve to raise taxes to maintain some of these forest preserves, which actually also have some beautiful prairies. I'll show you a picture of one later. So are the adults in this community going to be willing to vote yes for our forests and contribute more money to protecting and maintaining, and in some cases expanding, these natural resources? Or, you know, as time goes by, if we have less affinity for nature and less amenity capital, would we be less inclined to vote yes on ballot initiatives like this? So that's what we're interested in. The research questions that we initially posed for this project, one of them is this. So how does childhood experience with nature affect current willingness to pay, you know, the willingness to pay that you have as an adult for conservation and restoration of natural areas? And then secondly, because we had to do this research in some specific context, we can't just say nature because that's too vague. So we decided to do it in the context of grassland restoration. We live in Illinois, we're surrounded by grasslands, and I'll talk later, there's actually not very much research about the values of grasslands. So there's a lot of scope to contribute to that area of knowledge. And then finally, not just any old grassland restoration, but how do recreational attributes affect that restoration value? Do people just want grasslands restored, but, you know, just like that? Or do they want there to be trails and little fishing holes and other things? Are those recreational attributes important to the value that they would get from a grassland restoration? So how do we answer these research questions? We're going to use a choice experiment. And so we carry out a choice experiment survey in the 3 states that are the primary states of the tallgrass prairie ecoregion. I'm sure I got that title wrong, but and we also in that survey gather information about the respondents' childhood experience, the things that they did, and where they grew up. Was it near grasslands, near nature, that kind of thing? And so we do regressions on the survey results to understand the values of grassland restoration and attributes of it, and how childhood experience and location are related to those values. And just, you know, in case you have to skip out before the talk is over, or if you decide it is a gorgeous day out there, and so if people decide that they want to go outside and enjoy the nice weather because winter is coming, a preview of the findings, people like grassland restoration. Willingness to pay is pretty big, and it's doubled. The restoration value is seriously enhanced by having opportunities for active recreation in restored grasslands. And marginal willingness to pay, both for restoration and for amenities in it, is increased in some pretty complex ways by early childhood experience and exposure to grasslands and recreation. So I'll get more into the details of that as we go along. Okay. So a little bit of background. We'll begin with literature. So I'm going to back up. When you take welfare economics, you know, core microtheory, and you learn welfare economics, we have this idea that people have a utility function and it's fixed, and that's actually the foundation for much of welfare economics. But in fact, you know, if you just think about, introspect and think about your own life, preferences can change over time. And there's actually a little bit of a growing literature, even in economics, about something that people call preference formation. This idea that there's preference discovery. There's this recent paper by Delaney et al. About preference discovery. So, you know, there's something innate in you that will shape the things that you like and don't like, but you might not know if you haven't interacted with the thing. So if you've never tasted chocolate, which is hard to imagine, you might not know. You can, sometimes on the internet, right, you see that picture of the little kid eating chocolate for this first time. It's just amazing. Like if you've never had chocolate, you don't know that you like it, right? Or if you've never had lima beans, you don't know that you don't like those. So we can learn about our own preferences through experience. In psychology, there's more research about this. So psychologists, I've just listed two of the many papers, but there's a fair amount of research in psychology that finds that childhood experiences do shape adult attitudes and behavior in a variety of ways, and particularly in the context of nature. So there is a fair amount of psychology research supporting this idea, but we economists just haven't really kind of done a lot with that yet. So there's not a lot of research in environmental economics on the impact of childhood experience on environmental willingness to pay for, you know, people's willingness to pay for environmental goods and amenities. There's this one paper we found by Sato et al. That does a contingent valuation study of, I think, a mountain in Japan and the value that people place on that and how that related to their childhood experience. But that's about it. If anybody knows any other papers, please let me know. So there's kind of a hole there. In addition, there are very few papers that have estimated the values that people place on grasslands. So there's this paper that my former student, Sahanda Sanake, who's now at Portland State, and I wrote in 2014, but not a lot else. So we have a lot of research about wetlands and beaches and lakes and forests, generic open space, but not very much about grasslands. So there's room to add to that literature. Our paper was only about Illinois. So there are grasslands in many other places besides Illinois, so it's good to expand the scope. Well, so who cares about grasslands? I really miss being in a real room and getting to see people. So I would say, you know, raise your hand if you've ever visited grassland, but I guess you can't really do that. So we're specifically looking, there are three kinds of grasslands at least three kinds of grasslands in the United States. We're going to be focusing on tallgrass prairie. So tallgrass prairie provides habitat for a lot of birds and salamanders and invertebrates and things. It reduces erosion relative to crops. It can reduce flooding and sequester carbon. So here's a little picture. The kinds of plants that grow in grasslands have very deep roots. And so those roots are great for holding on to soil. They're great for sequestering carbon deep underground, and they're great for, I guess those are the main two things that the roots are. Oh, for flooding, right? Because it means that the ground is better. Precipitation sinks into the ground better rather than running off and contributing to flooding in the region. Also, the plants are pretty, and they provide habitat for butterflies and bees and birds and lots of other things. Unfortunately, well, I don't know, that's a normative statement. It is a fact. So this dark green area here on the right, that's the tallgrass prairie region. So there's Illinois. It does extend a little bit up into Michigan, a little bit there. But almost all of this has been converted to either cropland or developed areas. There is hardly any original grassland left, just a few remnants. And so increasingly, there's a lot of work being done to restore grasslands, which is something that we can do. So that's kind of exciting. I remember when I first moved to Illinois from the East Coast, and people were talking about restoration. It was really exciting to me because when you work on conservation, it can get pretty depressing when you start losing the fight and things get, torn up and developed and destroyed. So to be living in a region where everybody's like, you know what, we could restore huge areas of prairie to come back to being prairie, that's kind of an exciting thing. So there's ongoing efforts to restore more of the tallgrass prairie to what it used to be. And so here's a couple of pictures. In tallgrass, here's some people walking, and so you can see, you could have a trail through a tallgrass trail like that. Often the high quality tallgrass prairies will have hundreds of different kinds of plants, many of which have flowers, and they're great habitat for a wide range, hundreds of different kinds of birds. So, and in doing so, why do we need to estimate dollar values? Well, there are a variety of policy and management efforts afoot that could be informed by this research. So there's a couple of federal programs that promote grassland restoration. The Conservation Reserve Program, certainly, and some others as well. In addition, there are nonprofit organizations that restore and protect grasslands. In Illinois, the Nature Conservancy restored this very big area called the Nachusa grasslands. There's a picture. They reintroduced bison. I remember a couple of years ago, it was super exciting when the first wild bison to be born in Illinois was born, well, in like 100 years, was born on the Nachusa grasslands. So that's a very active thing that people are doing. In addition, there's this really fascinating ongoing effort to increase grassland pollinator habitat in rights of ways. So all those strips of land under the power lines, all the rights of ways along the roads, highways, along gas lines, along train tracks. There's like this national consortium of companies and environmental groups and scientists working together to try to figure out the best ways to increase grassland pollinator habitat in those right-of-ways. So that's cool too. So lots of people are interested in grassland restoration, but there's an ongoing question: how much do people value it, and to what extent do different characteristics of grasslands affect the value that we get out of them? So our hope is that we can inform a lot of these efforts. So the method that we use is a choice experiment survey. Many of you may know this method, but if you don't, I'll kind of walk you through a little bit of it. Whenever you set about to do some evaluation, you have to think about what approach you're going to use. And there's always a trade-off. If you use the revealed preference methods like travel cost methods, that would be the next most obvious one. Those are not hypothetical. And so it's a little bit hard to use revealed preference methods to estimate the value of a resource that's mostly gone. It's easier if there's a lot of it, so you can observe many cases where people are making choices about whether to go there or whether to live next to it and stuff like that. And also revealed preference methods can't estimate non-use values, and there could be some pretty significant non-use values to grasslands, especially, people call Illinois the prairie state. There's a little bit of a romanticism around prairie and wanting to have prairie come back and restoring the bison. Even if you don't want to go look at the bison, people got so excited when the bison were born in Illinois. So there could be some non-use values that are non-trivial that we would like to be able to estimate. So we're going to use a stated preference method because that way we can measure both use and non-use values, and we can study willingness to pay for something that doesn't yet exist. The drawback is that there could be some hypothetical bias, and so we're going to do a choice experiment, but we're going to do some things to try to mitigate the potential for hypothetical bias. So what does our survey look like? Well, I'm not going to show you all the pages of it, but at the beginning, there's some background information, and we describe what grasslands are, so people aren't thinking about their backyards or the golfing greens. So we explain what grasslands are, and we explain the context of this survey is to see how much they would support a possible grassland restoration project that would be funded with money from the state. And there are real grassland restoration projects, so it's in some ways a very salient thing. We explained to them that in the questions ahead, they should think of a bunch of the features of a possible grassland restoration project as being fixed. So all the possible things that we're going to describe to them are restoring unused marginal land, because we didn't want them to be thinking about converting cropland. It's 40 miles away, so that they're not, they know how, if they were interested in visiting, how long it would take to get there. It's 100 acres in size. Ecologists told us that that was sort of the minimum size to have a good functioning grassland. A moderate number of birds and wildflowers were a little more specific in the survey itself. And it has some basic things. It has a couple picnic tables, it has a few signs, it's got a little pond. So those are always going to be there. Here's some more pictures of grasslands. I know it's hard to sit. We all spend so much time on Zoom. It's hard to sit and watch seminars. So here's some more grassland pictures. There's some butterfly weed down below. So they can be pretty. And we did have some pictures so they could kind of see what tall grasslands look like. And then we described the variable features. So they're going to be the scenarios that they're choosing between, and these are the characteristics that the scenarios vary by. So there could be different numbers of species of birds in the restored area. A higher number of species means you're more likely to see more kinds of birds. We tell them if there's no restoration, there's only a few birds there. Biking and walking trials. Sorry, this is like our mock-up before we programmed it online. Trails, length of multi-use marked trails in the restored area. So that it could be a mile of trails, 2 miles of trails, or 3 miles of trails. But if there's no restoration, then there are no trails. And I think you saw a picture before of what that looks like walking on a trail through the grassland. Fishing. So some grasslands do have water, like ponds, and so there could be fishing. And so we said, well, this is an option. There could, at least one lake or pond has fish, and if fishing is allowed, you have to have a license. So there could be unlimited fishing, catch and release only, or no fishing allowed. So this is another thing that might vary. And then camping, we said different levels of camping. Either camping's allowed or not allowed. So there's either a place where you could pitch a tent and have a bathroom or not. Right. And Li Ching was the one who developed these, chose these variable attributes, and she did it by looking at other actual restored grasslands to see what kinds of amenities were there. So all of these things do exist. It is possible to have a little campground in a grassland and to have little fishing holes and stuff like that. So these are all completely plausible. And then the last variable attribute is the cost to your household. So it's the amount of money your household would have to pay every year to restore and maintain. It would be paid through an increase in annual property tax. And if you're a renter, sorry, that got cut off. But if you're a renter, this is the amount that you would end up paying in increased rent. So You can't get out of the annual cost just because you're not a homeowner. One way or another, you're going to pay this cost. And so this is what a choice question looks like. So suppose option A and B are the only grassland projects you could choose. Which one would you choose? And so these are the options. And so A, in this particular example, has a lot of species and a trail. Ooh, this is a nice one. Lots of fishing, ooh, but no camping. Pretty expensive though. Option B has camping, but no fishing and no trail, and is only $10. And so I have to sit here and think to myself, well, do I like one of these or nah? I would just rather skip it and have no restoration project. In which case, this is what that looks like, and there's no cost to me. So our survey respondents look at this and they make a choice, and then they go on to the next one. In our survey, there end up being 6 choice questions per respondent. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. We also did some things in the design of the survey that have been shown by research to mitigate bias somewhat. So we include what's called a cheap talk script, where we remind people, or we point out to people that often folks responding to hypothetical surveys overestimate how much money they would actually want to pay for something, and so they should, think hard about their actual budget and make sure that they would really be willing to pay that much money. We put an opt-out reminder on every single choice card. So we remind them, you don't have to accept either of these. You could just opt out and say no to grasslands. And we ask certainty questions after each choice question, how certain were you of your decision? And one thing you can do is, if people were really uncertain, you recode that as opting out, and see, do a robustness check to see if that affects your results. So there's choice questions, and then we ask a bunch of follow-up questions, which in most choice experiments is just like, yeah, whatever, we ask them some demographics. But in this survey, the follow-up questions are almost as important as the choice questions. So we do ask the standard demographic questions: age and race and gender and income and education, and what work are you doing and all that. We ask them where they're living right now. But then we ask them about where they lived when they were young, before age 13. We ask them to list all the towns and states, and if they can remember it, the zip codes. We ask them if there were natural areas near where they lived that they could visit in a single day. Were there grasslands where they lived that they could visit in a single day? And then we asked them about a whole bunch of different activities. So which of the following activities did you do before you were 13, and how much? So maybe you never did hiking or biking, but you did bird watching in your backyard, every week. And so hiking or biking, bird watching, fishing, camping, visiting natural areas, visiting a grassland specifically, spending time outdoors, and environmental education. This is the set of questions that got refined the most by our interactions with focus groups. Focus groups always had a lot of opinions about, how, this was clear or not clear. That frequently in a specific season it was added because people were like, well, I didn't go every week, but in the summer I went fishing almost every day because we'd go to stay with my grandpa, and he had a pond and blah, blah, blah. So we were trying to give people ways to respond that would be easy to be accurate about as an adult remembering your childhood. So you probably don't remember exactly how many times you went fishing, but you can probably remember the difference between never, every month, every week, that kind of thing. Okay, so survey administration. First, we carried out some focus groups to refine. That may be the last in-person focus groups that I do for a very long time. and then we designed the choice cards for the de-efficient experimental design and wound up with 3 blocks of 3 surveys with 6 questions each. And those questions appeared in the survey in random order, so you don't have to worry about learning effects or people getting tired. We did a pre-test on a small sample, and just to make sure everything was working and the attribute levels didn't need to be adjusted. And then did a full sample through Qualtrics panel in October 2019, the before times, and we got over 1,000 responses, pretty evenly divided between Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota. We asked Qualtrics to give us, to divide that 1,000 responses proportionately by population. We kind of clumped, we created some groups of counties and then said, we want, this is the population of these counties. We want this 1,000 divided between them according to their fraction of the total population of the region. We did a little oversampling of people in ages 18 to 40 because we thought, well, they're adults and but they're closer to remembering childhood. So I think before we do some actual, like, this is the value of grasslands, we should maybe wait for that. Okay, and then the econometrics, there's nothing new here. What this is a random utility model. So it specifies that the value that somebody gets from a particular restored grassland scenario is a function of the cost of it and the attributes of it and an error term. And the likelihood that they choose one scenario over the other or the status quo depends on these betas. And so you just estimate those parameters. We use what's called a fully correlated mixed logit. That's currently one of the main methods that people are using to deal with unobserved heterogeneity. In that, we assume that these beta parameters are normally distributed because we're agnostic about whether people like hiking or hate hiking. But the parameter on cost is log normal. We're assuming that people don't like to give their money away. And so the marginal willingness to pay for a particular attribute is actually the ratio of the coefficient on that attribute and, oh, there might be a minus sign missing, and the cost parameter. Okay, so what are we learning from our survey data? So first of all, let's just see what the sample looks like. Actually, our sample's pretty close demographically to the population of the region. I didn't put that in, but I might have it at the end if we need it. But anyway, so how much did people do stuff? So this is hiking. Half of the people did a lot of hiking, but there's 13% that never hiked and 34% occasionally hiked. Fishing, less common. So a third, almost, well, a quarter of our people never went fishing. Only a quarter frequently fished. Camping is also not super common. Only a quarter frequently camped. A third never went camping. Bird watching. Boy, I guess I'm showing myself here. Like half of the people never did bird watching as kids. Only 12% frequently did bird watching. I guess that's a nerdy adult thing. Little kids just like see birds without officially watching them. So we've got some variation in those things. And then where did they live? Did they live near nature? Like 3/4 of the people said, yeah, they live near nature. So there's not a lot of variation in that. But live near any grassland, only about half our sample grew up living near grasslands, for sure. 34% definitely didn't. 21% not sure, which I can totally imagine, right? When you're a little kid, like you may you know what you know, but you don't necessarily know what else is around you. So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of people just aren't really sure if they grew up near grasslands or not. So what do the regressions look like? Let's get to some results. This left column, this is the mixed multinomial logit on all the data just on the scenario attributes. So we include a status quo dummy because you're supposed to, but that actually in our case isn't just about capturing status quo bias. It captures the value that people have for having some kind of grassland restored, even if it doesn't have extra birds or trails or fishing or camping. But still you have a restored grassland instead of unused marginal land. And so in general, that's negative. People don't like that status quo. Marginal willingness to pay, it's negative $15. So if you flip that around, people would be willing to pay $15 to have some kind of grassland, even if it doesn't have any nice features. I guess the results are good because people like the good things and they don't like losing money. So they like birds and trails and catch and release fishing, and they like unlimited fishing more, and they like camping, and they don't like spending money. But what this boils down to in terms of dollars is in this marginal willingness to pay column. So the marginal willingness to pay for an additional bird species is pretty small, like 23 cents a year for one species. Although, you can end up with a lot of, so if you had 50 bird species, that starts to be something not entirely trivial. Trails, people are willing to pay an extra $3 a year to have trails in their grassland. Unlimited fishing, willing to pay an extra $2 a year to have unlimited fishing. And camping, willingness to pay is almost $3 a year to have a campground there in addition. Okay, so people like grasslands. If we bundle this into scenarios, so if you have a grassland with no recreational features, then willingness to pay per household per year is about $15. If it has some trails and a little bit of fishing and camping, it goes up to $22. And if you have 30 bird species and a 3-mile trail and unlimited fishing and camping, it's all the way up to $30. So, so this can end up being a fair amount of money. If you have a lot of households in the area, then that could be pretty significant. But what we're really interested in here is the heterogeneity. Now, I decided not to try like covering up columns, but so let's work with me here and we'll focus on column 1. So in column 1, what we're doing is we're interacting attributes like bird species with the kind of experience that's relevant. So this variable, bird species cross experience, that is the likelihood, sorry, that's the bird species times, that's actually bird watching. And that's actually not significant. So bird watching didn't make people like bird species more. Here, trails interacted with experience. That experience variable is whether you did hiking and biking a lot. And that's also not significant. So people don't like trails more just because they grew up, if they're the kind of person that grew up hiking and biking. Fishing, catch and release fishing, also experience not really mattering. So if you grew up fishing, that doesn't make you want catch and release fishing more. On the other hand, if you grew up fishing, this is significant. So growing up fishing is associated with a higher marginal willingness to pay for unlimited fishing in the grassland. And same thing with camping. If you grew up having experience with camping, then you have place a higher value on having campgrounds in the restored thing. So I think this is really interesting because the fishing is tricky. You can't just like walk out there with a stick and catch a fish. It takes skill. And camping is complicated. I actually did not grow up camping, and I'm a little bit intimidated by camping. It's like, well, how do I put up a tent, and how do I start a stove? And I don't really know what to do. So I guess it makes sense to me that these kinds of experience that teach you skills are associated with higher values for those related recreational attributes. Whereas, anybody can hike and bike, or at least hike, and anybody can look at birds. so there it might not have been so important for your future values that you did those things as a kid. Okay, so that's column 1. Column 2, this variable called experience in every case is whether you reported doing a lot of environmental education. And so this regression shows that if you interact education with status quo, people like the status quo even less. People who did a lot of environmental education like bird species more. And let's see, and camping more. People who did a lot of environmental education like camping more. So environmental education does have some positive or some significant interactions. And then over here, if the activity, the experience that you're looking at is actually visiting a grassland, people who reported visiting grasslands as kids have a higher marginal value for bird species and for unlimited fishing. No, sorry, bird species. I should have done this in separate columns because it's a big wide screen. Bird species and that's it. All right, it's actually easier to see on the next page. Whoops, let me go to the next page. Sometimes it's easier to see a picture than a table. So the status quo isn't here, but this is like the actual related activity. And so you can see that thing where unlimited fishing, the marginal willingness to pay is much higher if you frequently went fishing as a kid, and marginal willingness to pay is higher here. Although the confidence intervals for marginal willingness to pay overlap, confidence intervals can be big because remember, marginal willingness to pay is a ratio of the coefficient on the attribute and the coefficient on cost. Okay, so there's a little bit of an issue with those active, let me just go back to here. There's a little bit of an issue with those active, like I did a lot of fishing or I did a lot of camping, because while to some extent kids can't just go off and go camping by themselves, and so they only went camping because some adult made that possible for them, you can always try to say no, right? Kids have a little bit of agency. And so this isn't completely exogenous to the intrinsic fundamental preferences of these humans. So it could be that the kid who never wanted to go outside as a kid refused all the camping trips and now still doesn't want camping. And so, I think we have to be careful in the interpretation. On the other hand, kids totally do not get to pick where they live. And so this passive exposure, let's sort of see what this does. Remember that there's not a lot of variation in living near nature, and so it might not be surprising if these aren't that significant because of limited variation. But we do see that people who live near nature report higher preference for bird species and for trails. Oops, did not mean to do that. There we go. A higher preference for trails and for catch and release fishing. So actually, so a certain extent to which people who reported living near nature do have higher preferences for some of these things. People who reported living near the grassland have a stronger aversion to the status quo. So they are more interested in just having some kind of grassland restored, even if it doesn't have nice features. That's not true of just living near nature. So that's a little bit, maybe a little bit of evidence of this sort of affinity thing, that if you're a person who grew up near grasslands, it's like, yeah, I know grasslands, they're cool. Yes, we should restore more of them. Whereas if you have no idea, if these are the first pictures you've ever seen of a grassland, you might just have no idea and not be that interested in them. But living near grasslands is not, I mean, I guess a little bit more likely to like catch and release fishing, and camping. Those are the other two things that living near a grassland is associated with. So again, we have to put the status quo on here because that's one of the most interesting things. But we do see that the people who are exposed to grasslands have a much higher marginal willingness to pay for camping than otherwise, a little bit for catch and release fishing, but this is the main effect here. And this is a little bit of a summary of the differences in the mean willingness to pay that I showed you in those figures. So attribute related activities affect mean willingness to pay for unlimited fishing and camping. Environmental education affects mean willingness to pay for the status quo, bird species, and camping. And whether you visited a grassland affects your willingness to pay for the avoiding the status quo and having more bird species. Living near nature is positively increases a lot of these things, although a little weird that this is negative on unlimited fishing. Don't know what's up with that. Living near a grassland makes you more averse to the status quo of no restoration. And you have a little bit more of a preference for catch and release fishing and for camping. So we've got some associations here. These things do seem to be related. So conclusions so far, and I cannot emphasize enough how preliminary all of this is. But so the value of basic grassland restoration seems to be large, about $15 per household each year. And that can double with extensive recreational attributes. You know, I will take this finding, and I will tell this to the people who manage these county forest and grassland preserves, and I will tell it to the Nature Conservancy, because this is interesting information for people, because it costs money to maintain trails. They have to keep them mowed and stuff. So it helps to know if it's worth doing. It also does seem that people are willing to pay more for grassland restoration if they grew up near grasslands, and willingness to pay, clearly I edited that only, willing to pay is higher if people had actual experience in nature, especially for the ability to have relatively complex kinds of recreation. So camping and fishing, where it takes skills to go camping and fishing. If you learn those skills as a kid, you have more interest in supporting them as an adult. So amenity capital does kind of seem to matter. So, you know, if you have 5 minutes to sit back and think about research, which is getting scarce nowadays, when we're so overwhelmed with all of our extra work, there's a couple of kind of big picture implications that I've been mulling over. So one is climate change. There's a lot of conversation among ecologists and climate scientists about how climate change is moving ecosystems and species, that the places that used to be good climatologically for some things aren't anymore. And so if indeed these patterns that we seem to be seeing in our data are true, then you could end up with a spatial mismatch between species and ecosystems and the people who value them. So the people who grew up valuing grasslands aren't living near grasslands anymore, and the grasslands have moved somewhere to people who don't have an affinity for them. I think, I don't know, we can't make huge causal claims about any of this, but it does seem that there's some support for the idea that urbanization could undermine future public demand for conservation, to the extent to which that means that people as children are spending less time having experiences with nature. on the other hand, it does seem on the flip side that education and promotion of outdoor activity could mitigate that decline. That environmental education seemed to matter, or seemed at least to be correlated with values, and having outdoor activities were associated with values. And so, again, this is not a randomized controlled trial. We didn't randomly educate some kids and then check in with them 20 years later to see what their preferences are, but it does seem like this might be possibly a thing. There's also there's a lot of conversation, and I spend a lot of time thinking about environmental justice, and there's a lot of research showing patterns of inequity in access to high quality natural environments. So it could be, you could imagine long run dynamics. So if you have, right now in the United States, families who have low income and families who are Black and Latino are less likely to live in places that have access to high quality nature environments. So those kids are more likely to grow up without those experiences and without that exposure. And so they might grow up having less of a strong preference for those things. Now, there's nothing normative about that. We can't say this is good or bad, but it's a pattern. And so I chose the word inequality very carefully instead of inequity. We could maybe see those patterns of differences among different groups of people worsening over time because of this sort of negative feedback loop. You didn't grow up near nature, so you don't value nature, so you don't move to nature, or you don't vote to spend money protecting nature. Just something to think about as we have conversations about environmental justice. Okay, so I emphasized that this research isn't done, and that's true. So I think we need to do some more descriptive work. I think we had a conference deadline, and so we did a little bit of rushing to getting some regression results because everybody else always wants to see the regressions. But these things are not randomly assigned, and so it's quite likely that maybe the people who did the hiking are also the people who did the fishing. Who knows? So we should do more descriptive work about how those childhood experiences are correlated with each other, just to understand that. While we're interested in environmental justice, are there racial and ethnic differences in childhood experiences and current willingness to pay? We have data on race, so we could just kind of see what those patterns look like. If we haven't done that yet. We are also working, so right now what I've presented you is a whole bunch of regressions that basically have one measure of childhood experience interacted with the attributes. But so if they're correlated with each other, how can we possibly tell which features of childhood are most strongly correlated with preferences? We can't tell that from the work that I've shown you already. Is it really all about living near it? Or is environmental education the most important thing? So we're trying to figure out, choice experiment regressions get really messy if you have too many characteristics of individuals interacted with the attributes. It turns into a giant mess. That's a technical term. We've started working with a latent class model. I'll show you super preliminary stab at that. But if people have if there are any choice experiment experts in the room, there might be at least one of you out there. If you have other suggestions for ways to do this, that would be welcome. So this is what the latent class model looks like. A latent class model, this is actually the second stage. So you use features of people to assign them to different groups of people that have different patterns of preferences. And so when Li Ching tried this, and I'll show you the first stage on the next slide, she wound up with two classes. This class 2 is much more interested in the environmental stuff. They are willing to pay a lot to avoid the quo. They love birds and trails and fishing and camping. They love it all. Class 1 does not care. Maybe they like trails a little bit. All right, a little bit fishing, but it's small potatoes compared to class 2. So class 2, these are we love grasslands, we love environmental recreation. This is the regression that shows, and right now these are the only variables that we put in this regression. So if you have environmental education, you're less likely to be in class 1. If you had camped as a kid, you're less likely to be in class 1. If you went hiking, you're less likely to be in class 1. And if you live near a grassland, you're less likely to be in class 1. So this is one way to kind of pool all of these things together. And so we can see, it kind of seems like it's not just one factor driving everything, that environmental education and activities all kind of contribute, and living near a grassland all contribute to being in that class that really likes, has high willingness to pay for these things. You can't do the thing of seeing, hey, look, people who camped like camping. but so they're kind of trade-offs in the analysis. But so maybe we'll try to do more of this, and we can put more features of people in here, race and education and income and gender and all those things, and see how those characteristics of people affect which of our preference classes they're in. All right, so that was almost exactly an hour, as seems to be the norm. And that's all I've got. These are pictures of the two on the right are pictures I took last weekend at one of those Champaign County Forest Preserves. Thank you for your attention, and any comments and questions are very welcome.
Great, thank you so much, Amy. That was a really interesting talk. So yeah, we're gonna try and get it so that we can get everyone unmuted, and then people can raise their hand and ask their questions. But before that, we'll just start off with some of the questions from the chat. So Titus writes, Amy, thank you for accepting our invitation to present your research here at MSU and for giving an excellent presentation. And then his question is, could the estimates of marginal willingness to pay for grassland conservation and various amenities be low because the dollar value of the alternatives are not well defined?
The dollar value of the alternatives. Well, of course, the dollar value of the alternatives is never defined in choice experiments. It's possible that the description of the alternatives was not well defined, and so people were like, I don't even know what that means. How can you go camping in a grassland? Don't you need a mountain? So that's possible. We tried with the focus groups to avoid that kind of problem, but yeah, that is possible.
And then Scott, oh, sorry, go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, so Scott has 2 questions, so.
Oh yeah, so I put that into the chat, and then Matt said that he was going to let us talk. So yeah, the first question was whether you have anything in your survey that allowed you to get at the social interaction that people had, or the social capital that they associate with nature experiences. So if Lindy Robeson were here, he'd point to this, and I guess I look at it and I think for many people, certainly for me, things like going hiking or camping are associated with family and friends, and so I wonder if you can link them, but I also wonder to what extent they are inherently about the natural setting versus about the people that you're doing it with.
That's a good question. We did not ask anything about people. Now, if you're a 13-year-old, you're not going camping, or if you're 10-year-old, if you're little, you're probably not going camping by yourself. So, and initially you probably didn't go fishing by yourself, although once somebody taught you how to fish, you might have that independence to march down to the pond and do your own fishing. I'm getting this cute fuzzy feeling imagining that little kid. So you're right that some of these things are very intrinsically social activities, others are not. So I was an extremely antisocial little kid. My main interaction with nature was, I guess you would call it hiking. I just ran around a lot in the woods on the mountain behind my house, mostly by myself, and I loved it. So that's interesting, actually, that in some sense, the activities that are most social seem to have, I might think about that through that lens, that the activities that are more social for children may have had more of an impact on their preferences growing up. But we didn't ask anything specific about it.
I had a question. So I was sort of thinking about kind of what are the channels that could drive this, and I thought about the experience where like maybe nature is kind of an acquired taste, and if you do it, then you like it more. And then the other is that parents kind of transmit their preferences to their kids. So parents who move somewhere close to nature and like to be out in nature have kids that have to do that too. And I was wondering if that distinction kind of really matters for policy or for what you're doing, or if it's kind of all wrapped up in the same thing.
That's a good question. Actually, it probably does make a difference a little bit. So if you imagine that you're a policymaker and you have a goal, you want to make people care more about nature. But we live in a dystopian future, and the whole generation of current parents grew up deprived of nature and they don't care about nature. If this is all about parents transmitting their preferences, then you're basically out of luck. But if there's something, actually in this community, I think in a lot of communities, but in our community, the park district has little fishing clinics. So kids can just drop by the lake in downtown Urbana, and there are people there to help you fish. So even if nobody in your family knows how to fish, there are fishing experts who stand ready to fix this secular decline in fishing knowledge. So something about acquired taste, that's something where an intervention through schools or local organizations could help, well, again, with a normative, could encourage kids to acquire that taste. But, so I don't know, there's no way for us to identify that. We don't know what role parents played in the activities. Certainly the parents chose where they lived, but not what they did once they got there. It's a good point. It's at least worth putting in the discussion.
Go ahead, Frank.
Oh, that's great. You can see the hand raise tool. Hi, Amy. Thanks. I enjoyed your talk. I was expecting maybe to see some buffaloes, but that's a different presentation. I was just had a thought, you've got heterogeneity in the data and you're trying to tease it out and see how it relates to these potentially correlated measures of things people did when they were young. And then also presumably, other things about the people, some other demographic characteristics.
Yep.
And so one option, latent class is an option for teasing that out because you have too many things to interact directly, like in some of your models. So another option you have, if the latent class isn't working out, is you can take your mixed logit and use these post-estimation commands to, if you're using Stata, but you can do it. So you have 6 observations per person, and so you have this distribution around preferences, And so people in the population have heterogeneity, and they're drawn from the preference parameters are drawn from that distribution. Then you have the observed choices people make. And so you can form posterior probabilities that people would have chosen the thing they chosen, and then try to guess essentially where in the distribution of preferences are they likely to be if they made the kinds of choices they made facing the attributes they were given. And so that works better. I think my intuition is that that works better if you have a number of choices per person and not just a small number, but you have 6. So you might try it, and that lets you basically use the full suite of regression. And then you're regressing the posterior willingness to pay estimate, the dependent variable that you regressed on everything you know about the people, including all those experience variables.
Okay, great. I have seen people do that from time to time, and it always feels a little bit magical because the dependent variable is this thing that you just pulled out of your estimates. But yeah, okay. So if you tell me that's a totally valid thing to do, then
I'm not that huge of a fan of it, because you're really getting a lot out of your data. But I do think it's probably, and this is not an econometric proof, but my intuition is that it's better if you have more repeated observations than you have 6. So that sounds better than
and there's this trade-off in choice experiment design. If we had more questions per person, then our posterior estimate of their willingness to pay would be more precise. But also, who wants to answer more than just 6 choice questions? So there's sort of a trade-off there. Thank you. We'll give that a shot.
Scott, did you have another question?
I do. At the risk of sounding very superficial after Frank's deeply thoughtful methodological observation, I was just, so Amy, in case you should go and do something like this again, I'm kind of thinking, when I think of natural experiences, there's this whole range out there from things that are kind of low key, like walking on a prairie trail, versus the kind of wow experiences like, you're going to Yosemite or something. And I would hypothesize that people from urban backgrounds or backgrounds that haven't had much routine contact with nature, especially kind of low-key nature, may have greater willingness to pay for special features. What I think of as like the museum approach to nature. Like, we want to protect really special places, but we don't really care about ordinary places. And so if you at some point were to look at other kinds of natural settings beyond, say, prairies, I think it would be interesting to see if you detected a little more nuanced difference than just people who don't have natural experiences with nature are less willing to pay. Maybe
if there are graduate students listening, there's your next project. Actually, so I think Scott, that's a good point, and I think that might be reflected in the regression where we just included the variable for whether or not somebody simply lived near a grassland, and the people who lived near a grassland were willing to pay more for avoiding no restoration. So they'd pay $15 just to have grassland that you can't walk in, can't fish in, can't camp in, but it's there. And that might reflect a little bit of what you're getting at. Whereas, it's a good point. I have another student doing a choice experiment about, doing some survey research about grasslands. This is It's part of a project that's joint with some people at USDA, and they want us to do a national survey of the values of all the grasslands to use to inform debates about CRP grassland installations. But she's also going to do a little bit of a travel cost thing so that we can get some, combine some of the revealed and stated preference things. But given that there is another survey about this going out in the field, all comments are welcome.
Jinhua, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. So Amy, this is very nice and a very interesting presentation. I was thinking more about how early childhood exposure or education, those kind of variables, really evolve into either a preference or experience in affecting their willingness to pay. So in your data, you have the zip code of their current residence. So if there's a way of, which means that you can calculate their distances, right, to grassland or to nature. And to the extent that there is endogeneity in, in the decisions of where to live, you could also look at the effects of early childhood exposure to their current location choices.
What a great idea.
Right, and also tease out the effects of a preference that is formed in early childhood, as well as the experiences, right? It's almost like a moderation model, right? Or is that called mediation model, or I forgot the word, to look at the effects of the experience on both the location and also the indirect effect through the location on current willingness to pay, and also the direct effect of the early childhood experience on willingness to pay, right? So that's going to be basically answering several questions, right? Using your data.
Thank you. We have a lot of data, and we had always intended to include, we gathered the zip code about where they live so that we could do, actually, we hadn't thought about estimating the impact of early exposure on their choice of where to live. That's a great idea. We did intend to include it as maybe, actually, if we do latent class model, it ought to go in there, proximity to grasslands, because maybe, actually in my paper with Zahan, we did find that people who currently lived near grasslands were associated with a stronger preference for restoring new grasslands. Again, you can't tell the direction of causality, but it definitely belongs in the regression. So thank you. That's a really useful comment.
Yeah, and if somebody is really pushing for like endogeneity, then you could even treat the early, childhood experience as exogenous, as use that as an IV for the current location choice, their residence choice, right? And to tease that out. But anyway, yeah.
Great.
I had a question related to the zip code. So you have the zip code of where they live now, but you also have the zip code of where they grew up. Because I think it would be interesting to see kind of how accurate are people's own self-assessments. Just in and of itself, I think it's an interesting question of if people have an accurate understanding of how the place where they live, how proximal it is to nature.
We had really wanted to do that. We really wanted to, actually, we didn't really want to use their self-reports at all. We wanted to take their like, this is where I grew up, and then decide for ourselves what that meant. It just turns out to be really hard. First of all, people did a terrible job of like zip codes and some of the descriptions of where they lived. It was like hard to tell if that was a town or a county or a what. So there are some data quality issues with that. And then in addition, we'd have to find, you can't look at the land cover now. You would need to figure out what the land, you would need to have data on what land cover was like in that zip code back when this person was a kid. And Li Ching was having a little bit of trouble finding good, you know, land cover data that distinguishes between real grasslands and golf courses, that would allow us to do that. So we gave up on that a little bit, but I'm just going to make a note to myself to resurrect that. And so I think, you know, she was in a rush getting ready for a conference, and so turned to the easier things. But we should go back and the goal was to have this completely exogenous, not self-reported description of where, like, what the land cover was where they grew up. That turned out to be harder to get than we had hoped. If anybody has really good land cover data or data on where grasslands are, like, for every year for the past 80 years, let us know.
Do we have other questions?
Hearing none.
Amy, what you need to know is it's a stunningly beautiful day here in mid-Michigan.
I know. Like, why are any of you? I hope you're all outside listening to this talk. It's recorded. Go outside. Yeah. Well, thank you for listening in. And if anybody has any other ideas or thoughts, just let me know. And thanks for the invitation to come join you.
Yeah. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Amy.
you so much.
Nice talking with everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you again, Amy, for being part of our seminar series. I'm going to go ahead and close down the meeting. If there's